Welcome everyone. I'm Frances Hayashida. I direct the Latin American and Iberian Institute at UNM. The LAII promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. We proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through programming at UNM. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to indigenous peoples. We greatly recognize our history. Today's speaker, Dr. Jessica Carey-Webb, is an assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, as well as the coordinator of the Portuguese program here at UNM. Her research specializes in environmental cultural studies of Latin America. In particular, she focuses on the historical development, environmental representation, and sustainable future of the Brazilian Amazon. Dr. Carey-Webb holds a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese cultural studies from the University of Texas, Austin, as well as a BA in comparative literature, Spanish, and Latin American studies from the University of Michigan. Go blue. Sorry, I had to...
Where's Lenny?
No. Previously, she was a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow for the Natural Resources Defense Council, working on advocacy and policy related to the environment throughout Latin America, including grassland protection in Mexico, water issues in Chile, and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. Today she will be speaking to us on her exciting new book, Eyes on Amazonia, Transnational Perspectives on the Rubber Boom Frontier. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jessica Carey-Webb.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Frances, and thanks to LAII for inviting me and for all of you for being here and showing up to watch me try and distill many years of work and probably 300 pages into a around 35-minute presentation. So I'm going to be presenting to you about my recently published book with Vanderbilt University Press. There's the title of it right there. So that means I'm going to start really broadly about some of the theoretical approaches that I use, and eventually I'll get into the case studies that I look at in my chapters. I'm hoping we'll have a lot of time for discussion, since I'm very much not going to get to everything, and I do try, which is something I tell my students not to do, and then I do it anyway. But hopefully this can give you kind of an overarching vision of what my transnational perspective on the rubber boom frontier is. So. When I talk about my book or talk about my work in general, we all have a certain idea of the Amazon in our minds, right? So I like to just ground us first in the region itself, the spans of it, and some quick statistics about the Amazon that are really important. So I'm gonna get started. As many of you know, the Amazon is one of the most environmentally important regions in the world. It stretches across 8 independent countries: Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana, and a territory of France, French Guiana, each with their own environmental policies and histories. The complex river system of the Amazon basin forms the environmental and cultural veins of northern South America, spreading and connecting over 2 million square miles, around 1/20th of the entire Earth's surface, and containing about 17% of the world's freshwater. If the region were itself country, it would be the 9th largest in the world. Together, the lands that make up the Amazon are now home to over 30 million human inhabitants. Amazonia is a catch-all term for the basin that makes up over 35% of South America and forms the most biodiverse region in the world. As we consider how to address environmental disasters, particularly in these globally important ecosystems, the humanities can help us critically consider the history, justification, implications, and legacy of extractive projects at the root of climate change. Discourses and representations are crucial to the formation of extractive projects, as they construct how we understand and address them. I look at the past to think critically about present representation of diverse populations and contested land. The way outsiders have talked about, pictured, and exported images is reflected in more contemporary outcries to save the rainforest, or, on the other hand, as was the case with former right-wing president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, to raise the forest and reap its profits. And now is when I go really broad and sweeping, so hold on for a journey. In this section, I'm really going to talk about writings of the Amazon and some of the ways that the region has been pictured and exported over time. So the region's archive reveals it as a quintessential contact zone. Indeed, I take the name Eyes on Amazonia for several reasons: to highlight the visual and international scope of the narratives I analyze, to invoke Mary Louise Pratt's concept of the imperial traveler's gaze within the contact zone, and to reflect ongoing international and national projections onto the region. Travel accounts position the Amazon in stark contrast to modern urban centers, exoticizing it through the perceived otherness of its indigenous peoples. The Amazon's rich biodiversity, along with its role as a battleground for social and environmental conflicts, provides a lens through which global environmental inequalities can be explored. Despite its diversity, representations of the Amazon have often repeated familiar tropes: an Eden, a green hell, the world's medicine chest, within the global cultural imaginary. These images, shaped by historical travel narratives, were influenced by naturalists who framed the region as one of scientific and economic potential. Across various eras and genres, attempts to define the Amazon instead reveal a multiplicity of different Amazons. The relentless pursuit of wealth, whether through the mythical El Dorado or the region's natural resources, underscores the colonial legacy of extraction and environmental exploitation. Early colonial accounts by explorers such as Francisco de Orellana and Gaspar de Carvajal portrayed the Amazon as both abundant and treacherous, ripe for exploitation. Later, naturalists like Alexander von Humboldt used scientific exploration to uncover its ecological wealth while contributing to European botanical collections. In the 20th century, works like José Eustacio Rivera's La Voragine critiqued the Amazon's exploitation during the rubber boom, linking environmental destruction with the psychological toll on its inhabitants. Brazilian modernistas, meanwhile, reimagined the Amazon as a symbol of national identity, using its exoticism to position Brazil globally. Across these periods, a colonial gaze persists, shaping narratives about the Amazon that endure to this day. These representations, whether through travelogues or scientific accounts, were never neutral. The knowledge produced by naturalists, while framed as objective, was embedded in the ideologies of modernity and colonialism. The feminization of lands and peoples, the erasure of indigenous rights, and the intersections of racism and slavery justified European domination. These portrayals sought to transform the Amazon from an untamable wilderness into a manageable and exploitable space, commodifying both nature and human bodies. This rationale underpinned extraction, further entrenching colonial power dynamics. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the rubber boom, or the history leading up to the rubber boom and then into the rubber boom. So, from the beginning of European contact, Amazonia was contrasted with Europe and imbued with the hope of reinvention through extraction. In the colonial era, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British forces vied for control over northern South America to establish plantation and extractivist economies. Yet, unlike more central colonies such as sugar-producing regions in the Caribbean and northeast Brazil, European settlement in the Amazon remained sparse, limited by the region's harsh environment and lack of immediate economic returns. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries spread along the basin, creating missions to convert and colonize indigenous peoples. However, the Amazon was deemed inhospitable due to its tropical diseases, intense heat, and lack of transportation. Extractive industries were often preceded by collecting expeditions, which documented and exported plants and other natural resources back to Europe. Exporting these goods required the imposition of science over nature and the use of large labor forces to transport resources to colonial centers. Europeans exploited indigenous trade networks to facilitate extraction, turning the Amazon's rivers into routes for commodification. These extractive systems transformed the environment and displaced, deracinated, and enslaved native and non-native peoples of color. The social inequalities, ethnic discrimination, and environmental conflicts seen in Latin America today are legacies of colonial powers integrating the region into the global economy as a site for extraction. And that history sets the scene for the rubber boom. During the rubber boom, circa 1879 to 1912, global powers sought to extract the region's rubber wealth, solidifying an international system of exploitation. By the early 20th century, the Amazon had been transformed both ecologically and demographically. The extractivist economy, which had already been established, grew exponentially due to international competition for rubber. New technologies, like the vulcanization of rubber by Charles Goodyear in 1844, and advances in transportation, made rubber an essential commodity of the Second Industrial Revolution from roughly 1870 to 1914. British naturalist Richard Spruce, writing in 1908, described how the rubber trade had altered the region, noting the rise of new Amazonian cities and the abandonment of other industries as people flocked to the potential of rubber wealth. Throughout both the boom and bust, rubber extraction occurred with minimal government oversight, facilitating foreign exploitation. The perception of the Amazon as an impenetrable green hell hindered efforts to transform the region's economy in ways that might benefit indigenous and local peoples. And you can see one of the biggest representations of this influx of rubber boom wealth, which is the Opera House in Manaus, famously made from marble exported in from Italy and created as this kind of symbol of high culture in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. The rubber boom also coincided with the modernization of nation states, sparking territorial disputes and boundary delineations driven by international demand for rubber. Naturalists and cartographers, often leading exploration and mapping efforts for various imperial powers, served both scientific and imperial goals. Amid the technological advancements of the Second Industrial Revolution, Latin America remained a key exporter of natural resources, exacerbating social and economic inequalities. The deforestation driven by rubber extraction captured international attention, further intensifying the struggle to shape the Amazon's future. And this is a photograph Susie might recognize, maybe, but that I use in the introduction of my book, and I like to use it as kind of a symbol of a lot of the things that I'm trying to get at with this work. So this photograph showcases a central theme of the book, the destruction and extraction of natural resources from the Amazon. This image was created as part of the Brazilian government's efforts to map and manage Amazonia, led by Colonel Candido Rondon, one of the explorers that I examine in my chapter 2. And after teasing you for quite a while, I will get to the case studies eventually. The forest and landscape loom large, and the centered men are small in comparison, yet their stances tell a different story. They have felled the jungle, taming nature. They have cut the trees to set up telegraph poles, which will later turn into settlements and roads. The trees are tall, thin, and dense, yet also susceptible and defeated. They have been cut down and rearranged to incrementally build. The men, appearing defiant and self-assured, have parted the sea of trees, clearing a new Amazonian landscape, one where the sky is visible and clear. They have done the work of moving the wilderness into landscape. This photograph was produced as part of the Rondon Commission's charge to open the region to small settlements on the Amazonian frontier. The commission used photography as a tool of nation building, showcasing indigenous peoples in various stages of acculturation and the landscape in various degrees of management. The Rondon Commission widely publicized their photography that showed indigenous peoples in Amazonian lands in stages of development to display the state's power to represent the hidden interior. In the wealth of images created by the commission, again, some of which I examined in chapter 2, we can see the fashioning of the Amazonian frontier into a noble and as such conquerable space through photography. So another large element throughout this book is that I really look at photography and visual representations along with travel narrative. During the rubber boom, information collected and cataloged about the Amazon was of the utmost importance to generate profits for a growing global capitalism. Many of these mechanisms were in place long before the boom at the turn of the 20th century, and they built on legacies of extractivism, using narrative, mapping, and photography as tools to impose order over nature. Extractivism works hand in hand with the colonial and imperial project by creating disposable peripheries with the idea that there will always be a new place to exploit once resources are depleted at current sites of extraction. Amazonia has also been regarded as a frontier territory, or land in processual change. Indeed, as a frontier, the region can be seen as a space of potential conquest rather than a home, thus justifying extractive practices. Once transformed into a frontier, a location is available to become conquerable and profitable. During the rubber boom, a promise of rubber riches created another Amazonian El Dorado, in its wake producing a hollow frontier due to extractive practices or left-behinds of a boom and bust cycle to the detriment of the natural world and its inhabitants. To harness the extractive potential and environmental power of the Amazon, a frontier or wasteland narrative also helps justify settlement. The Amazon, as a imaginary final frontier upon which to project modern desire, is then only useful in its productivity. That productivity is achieved through capital production and its twin preoccupation with creating a modern idealized utopia. Yet the paradox: by being rendered productive, its other value, the representation of a nostalgic, innocent past, is destroyed. The surge in global demand for rubber drove exploitation and violence in the Amazon region as indigenous populations were displaced and subjected to forced labor. Economic prosperity for those in charge of the rubber industry exacerbated inequality while drawing migrant labor from drought-stricken regions, perpetuating a culture of exploitation. The rubber boom's collapse by 1913, catalyzed by the introduction of rubber trees to Asia, left a legacy of violence, extraction, and unfulfilled promise in the Amazon. The narratives I address in the book trace the social transformations of the period as they move from direct colonialism into an ideological imperialism. I argue that representations of the Amazon as a region in need of the civilizing influence of colonialism and modernization serve to legitimize and justify imperial control. In Eyes on Amazonia, I examine travelers to the Amazon who in different ways documented or reflected on the area during the first rubber boom or in its aftermath. These adventurers, writers, geographers, and filmmakers represented a region in flux, a resource for enterprising individuals, corporations, or national interests. They wrestled with the role that indigenous and local people should play in the region's future. Some advocated a conservation approach toward both the environment and indigenous cultures, while others argued for domination and assimilation of land and people. And at times, these two streams of thought were inseparable. Their fashioning of the region and its people hold conflicting sentiments, ambiguity, and trepidation. These sentiments and conflicts over the future of the region echo today's anxieties about deforestation, climate change, and sovereignty over the rainforest. Eyes on Amazonia is a study of the complex ways that race, gender, various forms of representation, mobility, empire, modernity, and even the personal identities of the writers have shaped the way the region is seen into the 21st century. I do 5 comparative case studies of travelers' representations of Amazonia from diverse source materials in multiple languages, don't recommend it, by travelers from different countries of origin and with wide-ranging views of the region and its peoples. While sharing histories of their own experiences, these writers all traverse territories under extreme economic and environmental exploitation at varying moments of emerging national authority. In each case study, the authors find their own cultural identities in flux as they attempt to understand the often overwhelming present and the potential future of the forest. At the core of my study is modernity. My students who were in my class earlier were just talking about all of these things, so here you get a little more context. Thanks for coming. Which involves the rise of modern nation states and citizens engaged in global and national capitalist economies with both benefits and drawbacks. Modernity is shaped by power and conflict and relies not only on economic and political forces, but also on ways of knowing and understanding the world. Scientific knowledge produced by naturalists exploring the Amazon is not culturally neutral or objective, it is part of modernity. This book examines how travel, scientific research, extraction, and development depict the Amazon as an unknown space, attempting to transform it into something controllable. In selecting my objects of analysis, I will get to in a second, I promise, I was interested in characters that demonstrated complexity in both their personal identities and representational choices. Some of the travelers I examined were closely tied to the rubber boom. Others had limited direct engagement in the rubber trade, but their narratives and cultural productions emerged from related historical moments. These travelers' documentations also include intriguing visual depictions through photographs, maps, and film. The diverse sources examined in the chapters tell a story through weaving together written word and images to relate an account of events or experiences, the very definition of narrative. Narratives, particularly travel narratives, are linear in nature, as travelers document their movement from one area to the next. This Western chronology is itself emblematic of modernity, where time is structured, managed, and incremental. The broad corpus examined in my book encompasses different contexts and time periods. However, questions of travel, knowledge production, race and identity, and resource extraction thematically connect them. The categorization and collection described within these narratives portray the Amazon as rapidly disappearing and thus in need of conservation, another form of the Western discourse of modernization and development. As such, there's a sense of wanting to capture spaces and cultures in maps, photography, and prose. Throughout this book, I examine reoccurring and relevant themes of racial subordination, resource extraction, and environmental anxiety that accompany nation building in the Americas. The chapters are sequenced semi-chronologically, but also move from direct experiences of rubber boom Amazonia towards retrospective reflections and the lasting impact on a collective cultural imaginary. Each case study is comparative in nature, revealing the nuances within different individualized gazes on the region and showing how personal identity informs political projections. While these travelers move through diverse geographic areas within the Amazon basin, they are all preoccupied with the future of the region on both a national and international scale. This transnational analysis of travel, exploration, and representation of the Amazon draws on the workings of colonialism and imperialism to examine the development of Latin American nation-states in an age of emerging global capitalism. Ultimately, these writings come together to create what Michel Foucault has called a history of the present, a tracing of the power struggles and issues that have shaped how we come to understand current realities. At the end of each chapter, there is a brief but necessary addendum that addresses the state of the territory or the result of the ideological imaginings covered in the chapter. I connect each chapter and explore with contemporary issues in the region. These addendums facilitate our understanding of a history of the present and demonstrate the ongoing features and impacts of social processes established during the rubber boom. They also allow us to better appreciate the resistance, resilience, and vision of local peoples. And I'm just going to give you one of those case studies today at the very end, but I'd be happy to talk more about them in the time that we chat. So, finally some case studies. Let's get out of the dense theoretical wanderings of my mind. So, in my first chapter, I begin with the understudied French geographers Octavie and Henri Coudreau, who mapped, photographed, and wrote travel diaries of the Amazon from 1893 to 1906, and at times were employed by the Brazilian government, specifically the government of Pará. I look at Octavie's self-identification, photography, and descriptions of indigenous and black people in the jungle in their restrictions and implications towards identity and place. In the photograph on the left here, we can see Octavie and Henri, before they set off on their first joint voyage together. Henri was already a pretty well-known explorer of the area. And so she came over from France after hearing rumors of him doing not great things with other women that he met along the way. And so she joins his expedition and he promptly passes away. And so she takes up the pen and continues on to 3 more journeys commissioned by the state of Pará, and she produces cartographical measurements, and there's even some sources that credit her with being the first female photographer in Amazonia. There's not a ton of information out there about her, so there's much more about Henri. So Octavie Coudreau's interactions with indigenous peoples and quilombos both challenge and reinforce imperial ideologies of race, gender, and modernization in the Amazon. Octavie creates highly racialized visions for the future of the Amazon that, in her estimation, depends on the management of indigenous peoples by European authorities and the eradication of quilombos. Her photography complicates her role, as she feminizes the gaze, yet masculinizes herself for authority, reflecting both her shifting identity and the racial and gendered hierarchy she navigates. She also dressed as a man, depending on what area they were traveling through, in order to give herself a more perceived authority. In my next chapter, I look at Theodore Roosevelt's last highly publicized journey abroad, alongside the Brazilian frontiersman I mentioned earlier, Cândido Rondon. This journey took place in 1912 to 1913. So like the Coudreaus, Roosevelt and Rondon perform their own forms of gendered and racial superiority as they implant technologies and project empire over the Amazon territory and its inhabitants. For Rondon, the Amazon offers the possibility of realizing the new Brazilian nation's dream of modernization through territorial domination and technological innovation. Roosevelt values precisely this lack of technology that makes the wilderness an exotic, pre-modern space for the staging of his masculinity. This chapter explores the relationship between landscape and power, the external imperial influence of Roosevelt, and the coloniality of power represented by Rondon's civilizing mission. Desperate to experience an authentic wilderness, Roosevelt actively seeks adventure. Rondon, however, travels with the explicit purpose of introducing technology and establishing settlements of acculturated indigenous peoples to build his Amazonian utopia. I really look at their two differing visions of wilderness that are highly informed by their nationalities and racial backgrounds. So this is also an adventure story, ultimately. Teddy Roosevelt, if you've ever read anything he's written, loves to write about adventure and go on them. And as the travelers went down the uncharted river, they confronted obstacle and various risks, including run-ins with indigenous groups, hostile animals and insects, multiple diseases and injuries, and the death of 3 men in their party. And I just wanted to include a little bit of where they actually ended up. So you can see a photograph of the whole expedition, a much thinner Roosevelt, next to this monument that they've erected that still stands. And this is where they landed in a photo taken from 2019. So at one point, Roosevelt, suffering from malarial fever, ultimately told the expedition to go on ahead without him. But they said, no way, we're gonna not let this president die on our watch, and they brought him into this region here, and they found a group of dispersed rubber tappers who helped them out. In my next chapter, I talk about the Brazilian vanguards Euclides da Cunha, here on the left, who wrote A Margem da História, or The Amazon Land Without History, in 1909, and Maria de Andrade, who wrote O Turista Aprendiz, which was published much later, called The Apprentice Tourist, but it was written during journeys to the Brazilian Amazon and the Northeast from 1927 to 1929. These are authors who sought to situate the Amazon and its people specifically within a Brazilian national culture. I argue that the travel narratives of Euclides da Cunha and Maria de Andrade position the Amazon as integral to Brazil's national identity. Euclides frames the Amazon as Brazilian territory through migration and settlement. Indeed, he's part of a demarcation mission between Peru and the Brazilian border, while Mario establishes the Amazon as cultural patrimony. Both authors engage with European cultural traditions, but create distinctly Brazilian texts, with Euclides focusing on territorial demarcation and Mario on representing the people and cultures of Amazonia. Together, their work serves to nationalize the Amazon, with Euclides solidifying borders and Mario highlighting its cultural significance within Brazil. After Mario's travels in Amazonia, the region became increasingly viewed as a site for settlement, particularly under President Getúlio Vargas's 1938 March to the West campaign, which sought to colonize Brazil's interior. World War II renewed interest in Amazonian rubber, as markets were cut off from Asian rubber plantations. That's why I keep saying the first rubber boom. There was a second one, spurring a short-lived secondary rubber boom. This once again encouraged migration from the Brazilian Northeast, with rubber workers framed as patriotic heroes. These developments frame the interventions I examine in the following chapter. So chapter 4 examines the anthropologic approaches of German Theodor Koch-Grünberg and American Richard Evans Schultz, explorers whose research critically investigated the relationship between nature and culture as they sought to open the so-called world's medicine chest through scientific inquiry. Their work spans from the heart of the rubber boom, beginning with Koch-Grünberg's travels to the region in 1896, through Schultz's work during the World War II secondary boom, and his continued contributions until the time of his death in 2001. Both explorers emphasize ways of understanding the world that they have witnessed and learned from indigenous peoples. For example, Koch-Grünberg advocates for indigenous voices to be heard through storytelling and collecting initiatives, while Schultz, known as the father of ethnobotany, advocates for indigenous contributions towards Western science. Koch-Grünberg and Schultz both attempt to learn from native Amazonians and in return to become advocates for indigenous peoples and the environment. While this still falls back on an extractive dynamic, in this chapter I analyze the confluence of nature and culture via more sympathetic interlocutors like Koch-Grünberg and Schultz. And finally, the book finishes with an analysis of El Abrazo de la Serpiente, or The Embrace of the Serpent, a 2015 film from Colombian director Ciro Guerra, retelling the journeys of Schultz and Koch-Grünberg that pays homage to the era of exploration and rubber booms while centering an indigenous protagonist. This chapter analyzes Guerra's film as a reconfigured version of the more traditional travel narrative explored in previous chapters as a new way to approach the genre, one that engages with indigenous cosmovisions and alternative ways of being. The film, as a take on the travel narrative, complicates the idea of knowledge production, circulation, and extraction through its periodic demonstrations of exchange and acknowledgement of the debt that Western knowledge owes to indigenous knowledges, particularly when that knowledge is plant-based. However, these complications fall back on problematic tropes of an indigenous character who only appears in relation to Western outsiders. Each narrative I examine grapples with the place of the Amazon within a world geography and increasingly globalized culture. While Rondon, Euclides, and Mario attempt to situate the Amazon's place within Brazil, the narrative, mapping, collecting, and photographic projects of Roosevelt, Kudrow, Hochberg, and Schultz move the Amazon into an international discourse that operates on the known. These justifications and projections serve to set the scene for the future of Amazonia, and therefore the future of the planet. The corpus I examine shows how a variety of outsiders to the Amazon, through travel to the region, put forward ideas about the future of the environment and Amazonian peoples in the midst of an era of intense extractivism. Each explorer also engages with travel in different ways, some as commissioned geographers and anthropologists, others as writers or filmmakers intent on showing the nuances of the region and its peoples. In each case, the act of travel itself is commented on, conceptualized, and used to justify their thoughts and actions. The interactions of these travelers experience within the social and biological contact zone of Amazonia reveal the ambiguities of knowledge creation. Travel narratives and natural histories produce knowledge supported by a multitude of maps, photographs, and statistics that facilitated the nationalization of territories, ecologies, and peoples, while also demonstrating the position of the Amazon in neo-imperial formations. Travel, already an elite activity, is experienced differently across racial, socioeconomic, and gender lines. Through these different materials, a rich and complicated patchwork is revealed, one that shows the evolving relationship between viewers and viewed and nature and culture. As such, this volume offers a reflection on the ways travelers engaged in various projects of collection for different nations interact with and portray the Amazon region, demonstrating at each turn the ambiguities of modernity. These histories can contribute to our understanding of current crises. The climate crisis urges us to re-examine the interrelatedness of nature and culture and question the inequalities of environmental destruction. Representations of Amazonia set up and continued to open the region to development, furthering a slow violence of environmental extraction. Ultimately, I look at issues of control, power, and dominance through the lens of various types of travel narrative. Within these narratives, most of the authors understood nature as separate from culture, repeating a Western discourse that does not actually fit an Amazonian reality. And I want to finish my discussion by going back to that idea of the history of the present that has really informed the way that I've shaped this book. In the case of the explorer that I examine in chapter 1, Octavie Kudrow, her maps, photographs, and census documentation of Quilombo, and I'm not sure if I said the definition of Quilombo, but essentially maroon communities, escaped enslaved peoples who founded settlements throughout Brazil, but many of which were in the Amazon region. So her documentation of Quilombo communities has been used as a decolonial tool toward establishing territory and land rights. In her book, Voyage ao Trombetas, the one that she finished when Henri died, and her next book, Voyage ao Cuminam, in 1901, Octavie explored the Trombetas River Basin. You can see kind of where that's at. The small community of Cachoeira Porteira, a quilombo on the Trombetas River, offers an example of the intersection of social and imperial mapping projects, as well as intercultural initiatives and the lasting impact of cultural contact. Cachoeira Porteira was formed when enslaved peoples sought to escape the Paraguayan war draft at the end of the 19th century. When white men came after escaped enslaved people who had found their way to the waters surrounding the community, they were unable to pass through the large waterfalls and thus considered the falls a porteira, or door that only black people could pass through. In the case of Cachoeira Porteira, Octavie included detailed census information, maps, and photographs in her travel narratives. And through collaborations with the Amazonian New Social Cartography Project, and that's what this second map on the other side, not the Google Maps one, the other one was created with, communities like Cachoeira Porteira have used social mapping techniques to assert their territorial claims. In 2018, Cachoeira Porteira was historically given dominio colectivo, or collective domain, from the state government, effectively granting the community title to their land. Through years of collective action and advocacy, more than 220,000 hectares of highly contested Amazon territory was granted to the descendants of formerly enslaved peoples. The small community where Octavie Coudreau first landed after the death of her husband in 1901 is now the largest titled Quilombo land in Brazil. While there are around 3,000 officially recognized Quilombos in Brazil, many do not possess title to their land. The document used to present Cachoeira Porteira's case of having historical domain over the land to the government of Pará included collective history, census data from Octavie Coudreau, saying essentially that this community had been in existence since at least 1901, and community-made maps, along with other proofs of territorial occupation. By combining historical documentation, including Octavie's work, with contemporary mapping technologies, this community gained legal recognition and land rights. This success highlights the transformative potential of social mapping in reversing the effects of exploitation and marginalization, as once oppressive colonial tools are now used for political advocacy and justice. Throughout the book, again, I connect each chapter with initiatives such as these, including extractive reserves, indigenous self-documentation, the practice of ethnobotany, and in this case, territorial autonomy. And I'd be very happy to talk more about that in the discussion section if y'all want, but I have spoken far long enough.
Time for questions?
Was case selection a pretty hard thing at the start?
Yes, absolutely. I initially started this project with Teddy Roosevelt because I was really interested in any of these like transnational perspectives, and I was really interested in his dynamic with Rondon, and then that kind of opened up other explorers. And I really wanted to have a female explorer, which at that point, there were certainly some female explorers of Amazonia, but generally always with their husbands, so they were always in pairs. And Octavie was kind of one that I found in a footnote. All of her work is in French, which was difficult for me. When I say the working in multiple languages, that was certainly a stretch at the time, and would be still. But that kind of, the Roosevelt piece kind of gave me that transnational piece, and then I moved from there. But it was a very long and hard process to add in different case studies, and actually between when I first submitted this to my publisher and the final version, I added an entire different chapter. I added all of those addendum. I did a lot of reworking of who I was talking about, but ultimately I wanted it to be based on a kind of travel narrative style, even though some of these aren't, some are more like field work or ethnographies, but at least have some nods to the travel narrative style, and then also are really have some relation with the rubber boom. So that kind of helped narrow it somewhat, but it was a lot.
I want to see the pirated edition of the also ran.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know probably with anyone that I have this fascination with like Mario Maraji, right, and the modernists and stuff. And I'm so interested in what maybe you found, what sort of interested you in terms of his identity and the way that he considered himself in this, because he was very, particular as a person, right? So
Yeah.
Just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So, I mean, you've read Macunaíma in my class. Otuhista Aprendiz is, it's a parody almost of a travel narrative. So it's written very much in the style of a travel narrative. He has, the dates and I moved from this place to this place, but he begins the whole thing by situating himself as this apprentice tourist. I mean, that's the title of the book itself. So he kind of pokes fun at the whole genre. He pokes fun at Uclis da Cunha. He's very self-effacing and inventive throughout it. So he also is coming up with encounters with indigenous tribes that don't exist, right? And he documents their language and their song, but they're not actual communities. And so part of what I think he's trying to get at there, I mean, I look at his and Euclides's narrative together because they're so starkly different and they come at very different times, but I think ultimately they're trying to do part of the same thing, which is nationalize the Amazon into Brazil, is to really like write the Amazon into part of the nation. And so Mario really does this in this way that is kind of classic Mario de Andrade, just like very, very satirical, which is really different. Did that fully answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Thanks, Natalie.
So I'm interested in Octavie,
Octavie, yeah.
Octavie
Or
Bourgeois.
Otile. That's another reason she hasn't been written about very much, is she also went by several different names, or just O.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because I didn't know about her. Was she connected to looking for rubber trees? Wasn't Henri?
He
Isn't
was,
that
yeah.
Bourgeois?
So she afterwards basically just did further explorations that he was already commissioned to do.
Oh, okay.
So there is some of that. She is much more focused on the racial and ethnic makeup of the places that she goes through than Henri was. Henri comments in his travel narratives much more on rubber trees, on landscape, on that kind of thing.
That's
Whereas
interesting. I thought he was
Octavie,
pretty good.
Yeah.
She's even better, huh?
yeah, she is, I mean, she's very, very racist. Even like so extremely racist for her time that that's another reason why I've found that maybe she wasn't as written about or as like concentrated on. Like to the point where, you know, other naturalists and explorers were like, no, this woman's a kook. She's too far out there in terms of her racial ideology. Where she was basically like, the eradication of all black people, and we need to import Europeans to manage the indigenous population. And she certainly has like some echoes of the noble savage ideal throughout her writings. But she's, in her writings that I work on at least, she's very much more focused on the ethnic and racial makeup than her husband, who did write about that too, but less so than her. So, yeah.
Do you notice any threads that unite all of the chapters? Like, is there anything that, because they're so different?
Yeah, they are. So that also was, you know, part of choosing the corpus that made it really difficult. I think when I decided to really focus on these aspects of travel and documentation, that's kind of what unites them more than anything. Like even with the film that I talk about in my last chapter, thinking about it as a kind of travel narrative itself, like a filmic travel narrative, as a take on the other travel narratives, is very derivative, but yeah, I mean, travel is kind of more than anything what unites all of them. I mean, travel, race, and gender, really, throughout all of them, although particularly in the first two chapters, I'm obviously looking at gender more so than in the subsequent chapters, but it's all over the place.
Sounds good.
Jessica, something caught my ear toward the end. The earlier explorers can't capture. They impose the nature-culture divide, and I'm wondering if in the film there's any success at seeing at overcoming that, or if those social maps are overcoming the nature-culture divide.
I think so for both, in both cases. I mean, like El Abrazo de la Serpiente, I'm not sure how many people have seen that film, but it makes really important steps towards thinking non-chronologically, like it doesn't follow any kind of discernible Western chronology. It also really centers plant and plant-based knowledge through an indigenous person, which also can feel a little, as I mentioned in the talk, extractive still, and that's kind of, you know, the issue I take with the film, but it does really, it reworks this structured travel narrative imposition of culture over nature towards centering nature, towards centering an indigenous protagonist. So there's some steps there. In each of the addendums that I have in the chapters, which include the social mapping project, yeah, I think that is a way to really start, well, one, to give more voice and autonomy towards local peoples. I mean, I'm talking about these really imperially infused travel narratives, and as I was writing this, I was like, I can't do this without at least some kind of balance or attention towards voices that aren't just these European explorers saying these horrible things, or, you know, interesting things at the very least. And so I also worked with this collective, at this point, like 10 years ago, but I met a woman who worked with them who was from that community, Cachoeira Porteira, and was telling me how her like parents and grandparents had always talked about that contact with Octavie Coudreau and her husband. Like they remembered it, and it was passed down through generations. This like woman who showed up in their community and had lost her husband, but they used all of these documents as proof that they had continual territorial occupation, which is rare to get when you're making a case for dominio colectivo. And because those, super imperial, highly racist narratives existed, they were able to get collective domain over their land. Like, those are the stories that, to me, I'm so much more interested in. And that's kind of how I reworked the book in its final stages of publication. I actually had this talk initially much more focused on the addendum part, because that's also where I see my research going next. But I was like, I'm already talking about too much, so I want to try and keep it a little more simple. So short answer, yes, I do think that there are these moves towards rethinking that, that imperial power structure, that separation between nature and culture.
So just something you said when you were answering Kathy, is that this community found this documentation from this little known explorer, and so I'm sort of curious about how communities are organized to find information. Are there community archives that they are also maintaining historical documents that are, so that when the opportunity opens up that they can do that.
So in this particular case, and I can speak to this better than to some of the other projects, so this is the Projeto Nova Cartografia Social da Amazônia, but they operate throughout Brazil, and they work with Quilombo and indigenous and local communities on doing social mapping projects.
It's like an NGO or something?
Yeah, it's a research collective more than an NGO, I would say, but they publish pamphlets, books, that kind of thing, all around these issues of territorial autonomy.
And to empower the communities.
Yeah, and so the way that it works is essentially that communities need to approach them, but usually that happens through some kind of relationship with a researcher, an anthropologist who's working in that community or has some contact with the community. And they say, would you be interested in this kind of social mapping project? Because we can help you with some of the documentation of how you would work towards a dominio colectivo. Okay. So, for this kind of map, they do a series of workshops with community members to teach them GIS skills if they want to learn that, and then to perform their own mapping of sites that are interesting or special for the community itself, versus some of the more imperial maps that Octavie was making, for example, that are just cartographic measurements. And so, I lost my train of thought. But did that answer your question more or less?
It did,
Yeah.
and then I mean, other people have other questions, but I'm just curious too though about them protecting the data. There's I can't remember what the name of it is. It's for indigenous mapping and information, but it's set up in such a way that they control all the information, and it's not and receive support to be able to do that.
So the information that the Projeto Nova Cartografia Social has, it's all available open access online, and they have they have they're headquartered in Manaus, and they have a library there that has a lot of these archives, but for the community produced work and community produced maps, those are just all online. Now I remember what I was going to say before. In terms of Octavie's materials, those are all public access online as well.
Okay.
But they are, they're all in French, so there is a little bit of a linguistic disparity there that I think is probably a large reason why she hasn't been talked about very much in English. A little bit from people working more on France and French Guiana, but not a ton. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Can I just ask this? Okay, when you talked about Mario Andrade, was his work on these communities related to modernism, somehow?
So he was writing from 1927 to 1929. So it's right in the period of modernismo at its height, right? And so part of what he's doing, he goes all over the Nordeste too, which actually you might be interested in looking at some point. But he collects, what he was doing all over the country is collecting cultural patrimony. And so he does this in this form of a travel narrative through the Nordeste and the Nordsee as part of the project Modernismo. So it's really like that modernista attempt to bring in peripheral areas into and kind of cannibalize them into the Brazilian cultural canon.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What's the end of the Rondon chapter? Like, what do you do similar to this?
Yeah, what do I do? Okay, for the Rondon chapter, I talk about extractive reserves. Actually, I can go back to that slide. That's one of the ones I cut. I went so back and forth on if I just wanted to focus more on the addendums or not. And anyway, so I talk about the current state of the territory where they wound up. And I talk about an extractive reserve that was established there called the Roosevelt Guaíba, I want to say, extractive reserve. And I talk a little bit about the history of extractive reserves and what that particular one has done in terms of collective organizing and community organizing. So that's pretty much every chapter, it's some kind of, at least ideologically, decolonial way of connection to the actual authors. Any questions?
First of all, thank you, Jessica, for this book and for bringing these topics to class also. My question is just more methodological about cultural studies and environment and humanities. I don't know how many of your corpus is fiction and non-fiction, but when you are working with fiction and reality, I mean, which is your position? I mean, what is fiction for you? What is literature and movies? It's just a representation. The reality is a mediation between the reader and the real world. Is just I mean, it's an issue that when we start writing and thinking on our project and stuff, we had to face in a way. So I just want to understand where your position.
So, how I look at the differences between a fictional narrative or a travel narrative that's meant to.
Yeah, I mean, a fiction work is not just reality. I mean, there's a mediation of the author that is writing of him in this thing. So, I mean, we can't take it as a document or an historical document in an archive.
Absolutely. So, I think the best way to answer that question is just to say context. Right, so I do a very sweeping stroke of all of this for this presentation, but essentially in each chapter that we're talking about this wide corpus of narratives, some of which are fiction, some of which are cartographic, some of which are just traditional travel narratives, some of which are between travel narrative, ethnography, and fiction in the case of Maria de Andrade. So it blends all of these different genres. I think the biggest thing that I try and pay attention to is the context of their production, the historical context that they're coming out in, and then using that kind of comparative approach to tease out what it is that they're saying, right? So, in the case of Luis da Cunha and Maria de Andrade, da Cunha is writing a really straightforward, almost scientific document, but I think you read some of his writing in my class.
Yeah,
he's you've blocked out los sectores. He had, even in this kind of writing that's very scientific, he's also blending a lot of genres in that itself. And so I really tried to use travel as the theme that was going to connect and help me try to understand all of these different types of narratives for how they talk about and reflect on travel, and also that within a context where you have major extractivism going on. So they're all also commenting on rubber in some way, shape, or form.
So your first interest was like the rubber boom, and not just like what was written about the rubber boom.
Yeah, exactly. I knew I wanted to do work in the Amazon, because it had so many languages, it had so much diversity, it had so many different countries involved and so many different ways and interesting things going on. And then I knew I really wanted to concentrate on some sort of environmental issue within the Amazon. And so and I was interested in working historically, at least partially. So that all kind of led me to that. But the biggest thing, I think, especially when you're doing a cultural studies work, is to really pay attention to context. You try and draw out those broader themes, but you have to talk about also the context in which those things are being written and the specific genres that they fall into.
That's for sure, but I think that we have also to position if our interest is the reality or what was written about the reality. So and in this way change everything from a methodological point of view.
Right. Well, that's also why I'm interested in the personal identity aspect, right? Like the personal identity of who these explorers were, and how they talk about themselves towards the beginning of their narratives, towards the end, like how travel in the Amazon has also changed them in certain ways is part of that, like thinking through the reality and the way that it's being produced in fiction or in nonfiction.
Yeah. And have you ever thought like broadening this Amazon like literature or whatever on like products like, for example, Mario Vargas Llosa's The Greenhouse, this colonial and Eurocentric view of the Amazon that has like many ties with Conrad's and of that, for example. Have you ever thought of broadening it to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point I'm a little done with the rubber boom. But I did get sucked back into, actually, Henri Coudreau founded a brief anarchist settlement right on the border between French Guiana and Brazil, and now I'm in a rabbit hole of my own making that I shouldn't be in, that I'm thinking about. But initially I was actually going to talk about, what's the Vargas Llosa book about, oh my gosh.
Casa Verde.
La Casa Verde?
No, not La Casa Verde. The one about the explorer, he's Irish,
El héroe.
Roger Casement.
El héroe,
Yeah. Anyway, I read that book. I was like,
Yeah.
this is for sure going to be a chapter, and it wasn't exactly what I wanted. I even did archival work in Ireland. I was like looking through. It was kind of cool, that part, but but it just didn't end up fitting quite in the way that I wanted it to. I think I also wanted to like have a mixture of kind of more canonical things and less canonical things. Like the Octavie Coudreau pieces are really non-canonical, versus like Teddy Roosevelt's travel diary has been written about to no end. And with the two Brazilian writers, I chose their much lesser known works than their B-list, their B-side kind of works, because I also wanted to see what it was I had to say before I really started to bring in other voices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you kind of mentioned something in that about how you wanted to work historically, and that was something that you kind of set out with this book. And I'm just curious as to why.
I wanted to be a historian more than I wanted to be a literary studies scholar, I think. But I'm not a very good historian, and so I was like, I'm really interested in some of these historical narratives. I started looking at the pictures, I think, and I was like, wow, what's going on here? I want to explore this a little bit. And so I wanted to, I don't know, for some reason I've always had this fascination with like the turn of the century, right in that era. I don't know what it is. I think it's just this era of like modernizing technologies, and everything seems to kind of massively speed up, and you get so much more of a U.S. strong arm in Latin America, and there's just all kinds of things going on in that particular era that I was really interested in. Not to mention, of course, just the extraction of rubber,
It's interesting to read, like, also this thing about photos, because that's like very popular. Looking at these like colonial or imperialist photographs is like very popular in our history right now. So I don't know,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
I mean, it's definitely a cultural studies project. I do like a little bit of everything, none of it very well. I just kind of like grab bag from history, anthropology, art history, literary studies, it's a little bit of everything, which luckily cultural studies exists, so I can say that that's what I do. and look a little bit at everything. But again, it's like that context piece that, is the work. And also being like not trained in anthropology or history, but being trained in literary studies. So it's like I'm still grounded ultimately in the text. Anything else? That was a full hour on the nose.